There's some folk wisdom in the black community, I'm told, about the civil rights movement. Mike, okay?
Yes.
If Rosa Parks had not sat down, Martin King would have not stood up. You know, when I was walking around here about 15 minutes before service, I bumped into someone who said, "Oh, I know who you are. People say you're a hoot." So I'm really looking forward to being entertained today, and I thought, oh, gosh. So the only thing I could think of was, my wife and I, Melanie, and I worked in Pittsburgh for 20 years, and one of the most important projects I was involved in was an organizing effort for low-income housing in the neighborhood. And I wound up working very, very closely with the community leaders in a group. And they happened to be all African-American women. There were 7 or 8 of them. And so we would go to meetings, the core group, and it would be these 7 or 8 women and myself. And I always felt a little uneasy. Maybe I don't belong here. I'm intruding. This is not my meeting. And one of the leaders kept assuring me that I was appropriate there. And she told me a story. She said, "You know, I was talking to my husband about you the other day, Art." And I said, "Well, you know Art McDonald." And he said, "Art McDonald." And she said, "Well, yeah." And she started to describe me. And, "Oh," he said, "that the little white guy with the afro. I know him." So she said, "No, no, no, Art, you have your ghetto card. You belong in this group." So whoever that person was, that's all I have. That's all I have. In 1978, I was just ordained as a Catholic priest, doing a year of extra study at a place called Union Theological Seminary in New York City. In a class I was taking with a brilliant feminist theologian named Beverly Harrison, throughout the term I sat next to the only African American in the class of about 15. She was also a female. There were not a lot of minority students at Union in those days, 1979. Katie was very down to earth, warm and friendly, more than a little timid. She was easy to talk with, and I liked her a lot. One of the reasons I sat next to her was that I felt a wee bit intimidated as well in this rather high-powered elite divinity school. And Katie offered me security. Despite our divergent backgrounds, she, a black female from the rural South, I, a white male from the urban Northeast, we had the following in common. We were both outsiders at this elite, male, mostly Protestant school. There were not many more Catholics than blacks at Union. Furthermore, neither Katie nor I had gone to an elite college like the majority of students at Union, many of whom were from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Both Katie and I had attended small parochial schools reflective of our cultural and religious and class backgrounds. Neither of us felt smart enough to be at Union, so we hardly ever said anything in class, except to one another. We hadn't yet gained our voices, you might say. Katie went to an all-black college in North Carolina, Barber Scotia College. And when I was asked where I went to college, this first-generation college grad explained, "Oh, I went to Providence College, this small Catholic school, across the street from Brown." At least within a few miles of the halls of Ivy. It had been years since I'd even thought about Katie or my time at Union and the feelings it raised, when some years back I picked up this book by a woman from Harvard, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, a book entitled "I've Known Rivers," from the famous poem by Langston Hughes. It was a book of stories about prominent black artists and intellectuals, and one of the chapters was a lengthy interview with a black female theologian from Temple University Dr. Katie Cannon, my friend from Union. Katie unfortunately died way too young a few years back, was a star in theological, religious, church, and feminist circles as an ordained Presbyterian minister, the first black female ordained by the Presbyterians in the U.S. in 1979, and of course then a professor. But in the interview, she talked a lot about her humble roots and how intimidated and alienated and isolated and depressed she was as the first black female to be accepted as a doctoral candidate at Union Seminary. When I read this, I was blown away to read about my old friend, to realize more deeply her pain during that period, as I remembered my own sense of inadequacy as a fellow outsider. But if I was an outsider, Katie was an outsider times 2 or 3, as black, female, and poor. In this interview, she related that even the handful of black males at the school who formed a black caucus excluded her. "What are you doing here?" they would ask when she'd show up for meetings. Yet through all of this, Katie survived and finished, became a serious scholar, and now the subject of books and articles. Beyond this, Katie has been a prominent member of a collective of women who refer to themselves as womanist thinkers and theologians, a term coined by Alice Walker, who says a womanist is a black feminist. She's not opposed to other feminists, but just aware that white feminists and black feminists have some very different issues to deal with. Among other courses that Katie taught in her brilliant career was a course called Womanist Ethics, dealing with questions such as, do black women make moral decisions differently from other people? And if so, why and how? If one is not only black and female, but poor, does that affect how one makes moral decisions? I found it intriguing to imagine that ethnicity, gender, and socioeconomics might change the way one looks at things morally. Katie certainly thought so. According to womanist thought, the dominant ethic in our society has been shaped by white male Protestants, basically. It's called self-reliance, frugality, and industry. We know it as the Protestant work ethic. Katie argues that this way of thinking ethically assumes 2 things: freedom of choice and the idea that success is possible for anyone who lives by these proclaimed virtues or rules. Neither of these 2 things, she writes, are the experiences of the vast majority in the black community, leastwise black women. So womanist ethics, how black women reflect on moral decisions, must create virtue within the context of being outsiders in the culture, being oppressed, and having freedom greatly restricted due to sexism, racism, and classism. In such a context, she argues, being moral means, how do I cope with and survive such conditions? So she tries to demonstrate her point. And she suggested that slaves resisted the slaveholder ethic, which held that slaves ought to be docile in the face of white domination and violence. In that context, Katie says, cheating, lying, and stealing were deemed virtuous and moral as forms of resistance to oppression. Such a moral viewpoint allowed blacks to survive and, in some cases, even prevail against the odds. In her writings and reflections on this womanist virtue, Katie draws a lot of inspiration from a black female author of the Harlem Renaissance, Zora Neale Hurston. Maybe some of you have read her novels. One famous novel is called Their Eyes Were Watching God, written in the 1930s. Another, Jonah's Gourd Vine. In this, it appears what Zora was doing was she put her mother into this fictional character named Lucy, who on her deathbed gave Icy, her daughter, one piece of advice, knowing that Icy's life would be full of discrimination and disillusionment. And she'd always be an outsider. And this was the advice. Don't you love nobody better than you do yourself. Do, and you'll be killed without being struck a blow. Don't you love nobody better than you do yourself. Do, and you'll be killed without being struck a blow. Like Katie, Zora Neale Hurston made it to an elite school in New York, Barnard, and became a prolific author. The moral wisdom passed on by her mother made her appreciate that as an outsider, merely surviving and continuing the struggle against oppression was virtuous. For Zora and Katie, what makes moral behavior is that which allows one to maintain feistiness about life that nobody can wipe out. In this worldview, the key virtues are dignity, grace, and courage. Courage, says Katie Cannon, is the staying power of the Black community, where individuals continue to affirm their own humanity in spite of institutionalized oppression. Katie thought Hurston a powerful example of this courage and dignity. In a 1928 article entitled, "How It Feels to Be Colored Me," Hurston proclaims, "Sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it doesn't make me angry. It merely astonishes me. How can anyone deny themselves the pleasure of my company? It's beyond me." I thought about my friend Katie and her literary mentor, Zora Neale Hurston, a few years ago upon seeing this amazing film called Hidden Figures. The true story of three African-American women who in 1961 were hired by NASA as trained mathematicians and one as an engineer to help with the launching of space travel. Like Katie, for much of her life, the women in this movie had their voices stifled. The movie, some of it we know fictionalized, depicts the constant obstacles these three women faced as they kept demonstrating to a mostly white male workforce their superior knowledge and acumen when it came to scientific and mathematic abilities. They faced overt discrimination, racism, and sexism. And yet, as Katie suggests about Womenist and Nora Thurston Neal's characters, they survived by demonstrating the virtues of dignity, grace, and courage. If you missed that movie, it's a reason, I guess, to subscribe to Netflix. In a scene in the movie, which made me think of Katie's articulation of womanist ethics, one of the women who realized she had to learn more about computers and computer language so she would be eligible to head up a department implementing data cards through a new IBM machine. She went to the library to get a book on Fortran language, only to be told by the librarian that there was a section for colored people, and those were the only books available to her. So, in a manner only a womanist ethicist like Katie Cannon could understand, you know the next line, right? With no other option available given the overt discrimination, she stole the book. And like a true womanist, and also a citizen and taxpayer, she had no trouble justifying the theft. It was an extraordinary story, which made me incredibly sad by the end. And there are still so many voices, people of color, immigrants, women, poor folks of all colors, whose voices count for far less than others, who are stifled in their cries for justice. And yet in these difficult political times, when the leadership of this country seems to be promoting policies that are making it even more difficult for some to prosper, I'm actually hopeful and encouraged that there are so many new voices that have emerged in these last years. I was inspired and proud to be part of the women-led march down in Boston right after the election, 2017. I've never been to the Commons with such a crowd of people. You couldn't literally move. There was one gent there who had a sign. I thought it was the best. He said, "If I'm marching, things are bad." Some people sensed that we were entering some crippling times. But it's become this national movement called Me Too. Women gaining their voice. Previous to that, in reaction to some incidents of police brutality, I was inspired by the movement Black Lives Matter, and so many have demonstrated solidarity with that movement. And more recently, we've heard these young voices articulating never again around gun violence after so many shootings, some in schools. Gaining their voice, starting a national movement, never again. And of course, more recently, this young woman from Sweden lecturing the United Nations on climate control. 16 years old. Like the prophets of old, who gained their voice, thinking they were speaking the word of God, and like our modern day prophets, Harriet Tubman, we're still waiting for that stamp, right? Harriet Tubman's stamp. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, Dorothy Day, who risked their lives to speak truth to power and encourage all of us to find our voices, despite the assault of our best values. Voices are rising up and crying out and calling each of us to listen and to gain our voices and help others to gain theirs. Katie's message, the womanist movement's message for all of us is, I believe, to break out of our narrow lens on the world and begin to imagine seeing society through the lens of someone very different from us. As I think our ECHO movement, our local ECHO movement is doing with dialogues around race and class. Especially trying to see through the lens of a total outsider who faces prejudice and discrimination because of being black or a female or gay or poor or an immigrant. Maybe that means rethinking how we all make judgments about moral behavior and try to imagine what outsiders might be experiencing in their very struggle just to survive in a hostile environment. Imagining with Katie and Zora Neale Houston how dignity, grace, and courage might be the supreme values. So I'm thankful for the relationship I had with Katie so many years ago at Union, and how much I learned from her, and more recently from her writings, as she has clearly gained her voice. She has offered me another lens on life and experience, and shown me how to articulate the feeling of being an outsider, the humiliation, the challenge to one's dignity and self-esteem. She and Zora have taught me that service and other-centeredness are wonderful virtues, but so is self-love. After reading about Katie and Sarah Lightfoot's book, I was determined to contact her. But she beat me to it. A year before my wife and I left Pittsburgh, where we lived for many, many years, Katie came to the seminary where I was teaching to give a lecture. And as we approached one another across the room, I remembered those big brown eyes, the warm smile, the incredible humor and laughter. But this time she seemed a little less timid. As I put out my hand, she stared at me with recognition and remembered, as I did, our similar outsider experiences at Union many years prior. In fact, she remembered a piece of our history that I hadn't. At our first class together with Beverly Harrison, we were all asked to pair off and interview one another, after which we had to introduce the other person to the rest of the group. And of course, Katie and I were already holding hands, so we just paired off and told our stories and introduced ourselves to the group. And what a joy to be reminded of that, these two timid outsiders starting to gain our voice, ever so timidly. Despite her notoriety, Katie knew that the struggle for dignity, grace, and acceptance took courage, and it still goes on, especially for Black women. In the book review by Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot concludes with this about Katie, and I'm quoting her impression of Katie. Katie knows that reconciliation will not come through denying the contradictions or masking of the pain. If reconciliation is to emerge, she knows that it will always be fragile, one fraught with small and large compromises. Wholeness will not come by erasing them or even easing them. It will come about by embracing them and learning to move between and among them with purposefulness, grace, and humor. Humor was one of Katie's greatest strategies for survival. And just to show that she, Katie, always has the latter, humor, in ample supply, she skewered the exclusionary attitude of Black males at Union as she reflected on why they might not have wanted her to be part of the Black caucus. Says Katie, well, you see, they were probably afraid that if I came to their potlucks, I might bring quiche, or yogurt, or tofu. As Katie said this, declares Lawrence, a large grin spread over her face, and we both laughed together about ancient and present James.